Tonight we want to talk about Mr. Canfield's map of Sauk County from 1859, and in particular 10 lithographic scenes that he included around the edge of the map. But before we do that, let's learn a little bit more about who Mr. Canfield was. William H. Canfield was born on April 9th, 1819, just south of Syracuse, New York. And he learned the trade of surveyor and civil engineer, and he worked on some projects in the New York State area on canals and other civil engineering projects with his father. And he married Cordelia Long there in New York State. And in 1842, they arrived in Wisconsin. He was 23, Cordelia was 19 and pregnant when they settled on the banks of Skillet Creek. They lived under their dry goods boxes for several weeks while Mr. Canfield put up a small log cabin, and that's where they lived that first winter, and for 17 years on the banks of Skillet Creek, raising their family, which would eventually include 5 children. Mr. Canfield's work as a surveyor took him all across Sauk County. He eventually entered over 3,000 farm surveys for people wanting their land surveyed so it could be purchased from the federal government or from other entities, and he got to know a lot of people, and he got to know every corner of Sauk County. And fortunately for us, he started writing down Sauk County history and also did things like create the map that we're going to talk about tonight. In 1859, Canfield published the first detailed map of Sauk County. It's not exactly a plat map, but it does include names of many of the landowners in Sauk County. There are over 1,700 names on the map, thanks to Ralph Kranick, a volunteer several years ago. He looked at the map close up and wrote down all of the names and indexed them, and I'll tell you how to find those later. And he also recorded 285 points of interest on the map that Canfield had noted, everything from ancient mounds to lime kilns to even the location of a counterfeiter's camp. And on the map, Canfield indicates that by this time he was able to do this map because he had done over 1,000 farm surveys, and he says he spent 3 months traveling the county to obtain the topography. The map is a true tour de force, just for its complexity and information. And the only thing equal to Canfield's work is the work of the lithographer, Mr. Louis Lippman of Milwaukee, who we know little about, but who is the one who, with his employees, created the 2 plates that created the map. And mind you, everything that you see on the map had to be done backwards on the lithographic plate so that it could be printed the right way. So kudos to Mr. Louis Lippman as well. Now, fortunately for us, Canfield filed a copy of his map with the Library of Congress. We do have a copy of the original map hanging in the museum, but it's rather yellow and crinkled, and it looks like it's over 170 years old. And fortunately, when Canfield filed a copy with the federal government, it was put in a drawer about 1861 and never saw the light of day until over 100 years later when it was scanned, and it is now available online at the Library of Congress website, and we'll tell you how to get there a little bit later. So fortunately their copy is pristine, still has its original coloring, and is flat. Now, as I mentioned, Canfield put 10 lithographic images around the edge of his map. The images were not done especially for this map. They were used other places, but Canfield collected them and added them to the edges of his map to provide a look at what Sauk County looked like. And we're going to go around the map tonight and look at those 10 images and see what they can tell us, see what's there now, and they'll tell us some of the history of Sauk County. Canfield also included on the edges of the map other interesting things like effigy mounds and ancient earthworks. So he was cognizant of the indigenous people that settled here, and thanks to him we know about many mounds that have since been destroyed around the county. And so this map also provides a look at Sauk County from over 1,000 years ago. So we're going to take a look at these 10 lithographic images around the edge of the map, starting at the upper left and going around counterclockwise. And the first one up is the village of Ironton. The ironworks at Ironton was of great importance in 1859. It had started just a few years earlier in 1855 when a man named Jonas Tower took advantage of the iron ore that was literally laying around on the surface in the sandstone of the area. And we can see that he had a blast furnace and foundry, which made pig metal and castings made to order by J. Tower, his name on the side of the building there in Ironton. He was not the first person, however, to realize the potential of the area. Of course, the indigenous people certainly knew of the iron ore in this area, but the first Euro-American to take advantage of it was David C. Reed, the founder of Reedsburg, who heard about the iron in this region and purchased the land in the area, but unfortunately for him did not take advantage of it. He concentrated his efforts on the water power and sawmill at what would become the town of Reedsburg. So it wasn't until 1855 when Jonas Tower came along and realized the full potential of the area by creating a furnace and village around it, which is now Ironton, and mining the iron about a mile to the south along the east bank of Tower Creek. Mr. Tower did have some partners along the way, but ultimately was the sole owner of the Ironton Ironworks and shouldered the burden of it and the village that was now several hundred people until his death in 1863. Later owners eventually enlarged the foundry, which was established in connection with the furnace, and made larger castings like plows, wagon tires, kettles, hop stoves when the hops boom was in swing in Sauk County, and other smaller items. And the enterprise lasted into the 1880s before it eventually died due to competition from much larger iron fields in northern Wisconsin and Michigan. The village of Ironton thrived during the time that the ironworks was in business, but the lack of a railroad connection made it economically unfeasible after a while to haul all of that iron ore out of Ironton. The village is still there, of course, but much smaller than you even see it here. This is the approximate location of the Ironton Ironworks in the village. This gives you some idea of where that would have stood in the village. And of course, the history of this area lives on in the name of the village of Ironton as well as the town of Ironton. Out in the woods, just south of the village of Ironton, you can still see evidence of the iron mining operation there on the surface. The next view that Canfield included on his map was of the upper mills at Baraboo, with Metcalf, Paddock, and Waterman as owners and proprietors. Also, Ryan and Hollenbeck having a chair and cabinetware manufactory there as well. To give us some idea of where this was located, we go to another map that Canfield produced in 1872 of the Baraboo area. And here we can see where this was located in what is now West Baraboo, or the village of Lyons back then, and by this point in 1872 now owned by Thomas, Claude, and Thomas, and there being a hub spoke and wagon gearing manufacturer and sawmill there as well. If we look at a modern view of the area, we can see that this is in the location of the old Highway 12 bridge there in West Baraboo, and the building with the large white roof currently houses Slumberland Furniture. If we overlay the two maps, we can see that the bridge is in exactly the same location and that the dam was just upstream to the left of the bridge. And there is still some rubble in the water indicating where that was, but it's the only evidence of this once important site. The site was first developed as early as 1843 when the water power was claimed here, and by the fall of 1844, just in time for a large load of logs coming down the river to be sawn, the water power and sawmill were in operation. Eventually, several families lived in and around the mill area, giving the appearance of a small village in the woods. By 1850, the sawmill was producing an average of 1 million board feet of lumber per year. As we saw in the lithographic image, Ryan and Hollenbeck had a furniture factory at the site. They were both from Portage, and in 1855 set up factory equipment there to produce furniture. They had a hard time at first, but eventually became a lucrative manufacturer, making sales of $10,000 to $20,000 annually, concentrating on bedsteads and chairs. Going back to the 1872 map, we see once again the hub, spoke, and wagon gearing manufactory, and this dealt primarily in making parts for wagon wheels. The hub was the center portion of a wagon wheel where the spokes were inserted, and it was a complicated piece to make. It had to be turned on a lathe, and many of these were made here at this water power. The site today shows the current bridge in exactly the same location as the bridge shown in the lithograph, and just upstream was the dam. The next scene that we come to is a view of Upper Sauk, or the village of Prairie Du Sac, and it's the only village scene that Canfield included on the map, probably because it was the only one that was available. That was most certainly done from a photograph taken from the east side of the Wisconsin River looking to the northwest. And it shows the village as well as a very important bridge that we'll talk about in a minute. Prairie Du Sac was one of the earliest white settlements in Sauk County, established about 1839. Before that time, the Fox and Wisconsin rivers during the 1830s were a dividing line between white settlement to the east and south primarily, and Native Americans' lands to the north and west, including the lands of the Ho-Chunk Indians. And in 1837, the Ho-Chunk were coerced into signing a treaty giving up all of their lands in Wisconsin, and they were asked to move to a reservation in Iowa. So after the treaty opened up the lands that would become Sauk County, white settlers began arriving, and in 1839, Daniel Crocker, a native of New York State, set up a store in the area that would eventually become the village of Prairie Du Sac. And on July 4th, 1839, the first Independence Day celebration was held at Prairie Du Sac with 25 people being present. By 1840, largely due to the people at Prairie Du Sac petitioning the territorial legislature, Sauk County was laid out geographically, and 4 years later, in 1844, county government started. And the first thing to be done in setting up the county government was deciding where the county seat would be located. 3 commissioners were selected by the territorial government to take a survey of Sauk County and decide where the county seat would be. And basically it was decided that a contest would be held between Prairie Du Sac and its rival to the south, Sauk City, or Haratsi as it was then known after the Hungarian count who set up the village. And whichever community could provide the county with the most in way of free lots for county buildings and development, they would win the county seat. Sauk City offered the use of a building for the county courthouse as well as some lots, but the offer from Prairie Du Sac, which included more land, won the day, and Prairie Du Sac became the first county seat for Sauk County. It was discovered, however, after the decision was made, that there was a provision in the agreement that if the county seat ever left Prairie Du Sac, the lots given to the county would revert back to their original owner. and this upset a lot of people in Sauk City as well as in the Baraboo Valley. And in 1846, a referendum was held, and it was decided to move the county seat to the Baraboo Valley. Nonetheless, Prairie Du Sac, even though stripped of its title as county seat, in 1846 continued to grow. This is a view of both Sauk City and Prairie Du Sac done by Father Maximilian Gartner, an Austrian priest who served the Catholic people in the area. And he did this little watercolor painting in his journal, the lower part being Sauk City and the upper part being Prairie Du Sac. And if we look at just Prairie Du Sac, we can see that there are a few buildings clustered along the banks of the Wisconsin River with the large Sauk Prairie area behind it. So this is really one of the first images of any community in Sauk County. And if we contrast this with the lithograph from approximately 13 years later, we can see a tremendous growth in the village. We also can compare this image to a picture that was done in 1860. And even in the short time between these two images, you can see there's even more growth in Prairie Du Sac. And of course, a lot of this was helped because of the bridge that you see across the Wisconsin River. And we'll talk about that in a minute. On the foreground of the picture, on the east bank of the Wisconsin River, you see the little village of Clifton that sprang up along the approach to the bridge and was not able, however, to compete with Prairie Du Sac and Sauk City on the other side. So eventually it did become a ghost town. The bridge at Prairie Du Sac was quite a feat. It was first built in 1851. And just as they completed it, the river ice took it out, and it was immediately rebuilt on stone piers this time instead of wooden piers in the Wisconsin River. And then it lasted for nearly 70 years. This view from the Prairie Du Sac side looking southeast shows the bridge. It did have a movable section in the middle that could be swung open to allow paddle wheelers to go upstream. And on the other side of the river there, you see the village of Clifton at the end of the bridge. And then off to the right, in the middle of the picture, you see the buildings that are still in place at Wollersheim Winery today. So looking once more at the image of Prairie Du Sac from the 1859 map, the closest that you can get to this view today is by going to Wollersheim Winery. And this is the view that you can get. The road that you see on the other side of the river, just left of center, is approximately where that first bridge crossed the Wisconsin River. The next image on Canfield's map shows the Bassett's or Baraboo Mills located along the banks of the Baraboo River in the village of Baraboo, and you can see that this lithograph was done by Lippman and Riddle of Milwaukee, so probably done earlier than the map, again by Mr. Louis Lippman, but in partnership with a man named Mr. Riddle. The Bassett Mill was the largest flour mill ever built along the Baraboo River and was one of the largest industries in Sauk County at one time. The mill was located in the heart of what is now the city of Baraboo at the Oak Street Dam on the north shore of the river, and was really in the heart of the beginnings of the settlement at Baraboo. The first dam along the Baraboo River in this area was built in 1844 by George Brown, who came here from Whitewater and claimed the water power at this area. And besides building the first dam and sawmill, George Brown also platted the village of Baraboo in 1847. It existed mostly on the south side of the river near the sawmill, but a little bit on the north side of the river as well. Also in 1847, Sauk County government platted a neighboring village called Adams, which was built on the north banks of the Baraboo River around a public square which would eventually hold the county courthouse. With two villages right next to each other, eventually they were both combined and known simply as Baraboo. George Brown realized that he could harness the water at this location in two ways, one on the south side of the river and also on the north side of the river. So a chase for the water was built there, and a flour mill was begun on the north side of the river in 1846. Unfortunately, in 1847, George Brown was killed during the construction of an addition to the grist mill when some of the timber work fell, and he was killed at the tender age of 27. The mill did continue by others, but eventually was destroyed by fire in October of 1852. In 1855, Patrick Bassett and J.P. Sanford purchased the water power from the Brown estate and began construction of a new flour and grist mill on the site. This was twice enlarged and eventually contained 6 run of stone or 6 grinding wheels and could produce up to 25,000 barrels of flour a year. Of course, this was hampered by the lack of a railroad in Baraboo at the time, so all of the flour had to be hauled out in wagons by barrel to either Newport to the north or Sauk Prairie to the south to be exported. The Bassett Mill was destroyed on July 5th, 1902 in the early morning hours, presumably from fireworks that had been let off the evening before for July 4th celebrations. This was one of the largest fires in Baraboo up to that point. Firemen could not save the building and were kept busy just keeping neighboring buildings from going up in flames. Scorched papers from the mill were found the next day 3 miles away. A few years later, the building site was replaced when George MacArthur put up a new building for his towel manufacturing in the city of Baraboo in about 1908 along Water Street. And if we go back to the lithograph one more time, this is what that looks like. And approximately the same view today looking southwest across the Baraboo River. Next lithograph we want to talk about that Canfield included was the county courthouse, the pride of the county, sitting in the middle of the public square. As I mentioned earlier, after the county seat was moved from Prairie Du Sac, it was established in the Baraboo Valley, and the county government platted a village on the north side of the Baraboo River and named it Adams, and included a public square where the courthouse would eventually be located. The first courthouse was a wooden building that was built on the north side of the square. Knowing that it would be a temporary structure, they didn't want to place it in the middle of the square where they would eventually build a brick courthouse. That courthouse was built between 1855 and 57. All of the brick had to be made locally because there was no railroad in Baraboo yet, so it took a long time to complete the building, but when it was finished, it was the pride of the county. This view from 1872 is looking northwest across the square, and you can see the brick courthouse there in the middle. Behind the flagpole on the north side of the square is eventually where the Al Ringling Theater would sit today. The building served the county for many years. Eventually an addition was added in 1884, which is on the left side of this picture. But by the turn of the 20th century, the building was literally falling apart, and it was decided that it would be replaced. Shortly after a resolution was passed authorizing the construction of a new county courthouse, the building went up in flames in December of 1904, almost seeming to exact revenge for its replacement. Fortunately, most of the county records were stored in fireproof vaults and safes inside the building, and one of the few documents to go up in flames was the actual resolution authorizing a new courthouse. The building was replaced in 1905 into 1906 when the new courthouse that we know today was completed. It was designed by Ferry and Kloss of Milwaukee, and although a lovely building today, at the time it was considered to be rather plain, and eventually the small cupola on top was enlarged with a clock tower. Part and parcel with the county courthouse was the county jail, and this was one of the first buildings that Sauk County government built. And this lithographic image shows the second jail for Sauk County, a stone jail. And this lithograph, we actually know how it was made because we have the actual photograph from which it was produced. Here you can see the original photograph with the same people standing on the steps of the jail. However, the lithographer omitted certain things like the wagon and horse out front. This was Sauk County's second jail building. The first jail building was a log structure built on the north side of the square, meant as a temporary jail. It was so flimsy that one of the earliest inmates, Abe Wood, literally dug his way out by lifting the floorboards. That was remedied when this jail was built in 1857. It was built of stone, 2 stories, and was rather novel in that it was a 6-sided building. Octagon buildings were a fad in the early 1850s, and even rarer than an octagon building was a 6-sided building, which this was. The jail, although being modern for its time, had its problems with ventilation, particularly because the indoor privies that it contained. And it was also not foolproof. There were a couple of escapes in the 1870s when classically files were gotten to the prisoners and window bars were loosened, and the prisoners escaped using bed sheets. The jail was enlarged in 1863. Here we see it on one of the bird's eye drawings for Baraboo along First and Broadway, and behind it there to the left you can see the wooden addition that was added to it. The building lasted until 1890 when it was replaced by a new modern Sauk County jail building just to the north of it on the corner of 2nd and Broadway. This building was designed by Conover and Porter of Madison, and besides being up to date functionally, it also looked the part, looking like a castle fortress. Both the hexagonal jail and this building were also the residence for the sheriff and his family if he had one. The 1890 jail lasted until 1963 when it was replaced by a new jail in addition to the Sauk County Courthouse on the square. Unfortunately, the building was razed at that time. Here's a view from the corner of 2nd and Broadway, and just to the left would have been the location of the former hexagonal jail. By the way, the site of this jail was the location for the first Ringling Brothers tented circus performance in May of 1884 when it was still a vacant lot. The old stone jail from the 1859 map sat where the current Baraboo Post Office sits today. The next view we want to talk about is what Canfield labeled Lake of the Bluffs, or Devil's Lake. Of course, one of the premier spots in Sauk County for tourism and natural areas. The lake is particularly significant to the Ho-Chunk people, who have an oral stories about the creation of the lake and the water spirits and thunderbirds there. And of course, at the lake, there are still mounds that indicate indigenous peoples in that area over 1,000 years ago. This is the bird mound from the South Shore area. John T. de la Ronde is usually credited as the first non-native person to describe Devil's Lake in a memoir that he penned. And he recalls in mid-July of 1832 that he went to Devil's Lake, which was just a little south of what would become the village of Baraboo. And he said, "The lake is surrounded by high bluffs, and I could not see the sun till about 10 or 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and it would disappear about 2 or 3 o'clock. So hemmed in by bluffs is this romantic body of water." Canfield included the Devil's Lake on his 1859 map, of course, and you can see there he tried to promote some different names for it: Lake of the Hills, or Devil's Lake if you must. Of course, that is the name that stuck. and he shows some of the property owners around the lake at that time, including at the north shore at the top, El Claude. And if we look at the lithograph once again, tucked in the bottom right side of the picture, you can see a small structure peeking out, and that is the home of El Claude, or Louis Claude. Louis Claude was an English immigrant that came to the United States in the early 1850s and eventually found his way to Devil's Lake, where in 1856 he began construction on a fabulous house on the North Shore that he nicknamed Eagle Crag. This was a Tudor Revival or Gothic Revival style building on the North Shore, and it was quite large, and he built it himself, did a lot of the carving himself, and this is where he and his wife raised 2 children. The interior of the house was equally as magnificent as the outside, with many hand-carved pieces done by Louis Claude himself, including the mantelpiece, frames, pieces of furniture, and it was an exceptional place to grow up. His son, also named Louis Claude, would go on to become an architect, eventually going into partnership with Edward Stark of Madison. And we know the firm of Claude and Stark today as the architects for the Sauk County History Center, which was originally built as the Island Woolen Mill office building. The next lithograph we want to talk about is a view of William Johnson's residence on Sauk Prairie. William Johnson, or Uncle Billy Johnson as he was nicknamed, was born in Troy, New York in 1789 and came to Wisconsin in 1836. And after settlement on this side of the Wisconsin River was opened, he came in December of 1838 exploring the Sauk Prairie area. He eventually found a piece of land on the west side of the Sauk Prairie at the base of a small bluff that he liked, and he immediately set about staking a claim to that area. And in the spring of 1839, he came with 5 ox teams, a set of blacksmith's tool, and a large breaking plow. That summer alone, he broke 60 acres of land and did more for his neighbors. And when the land came up for sale through the federal government, he purchased 640 acres of the Sauk Prairie. His location was noted on the 1859 map by Mr. Canfield, again at the base of that small bluff, which had an elevation of 168 feet. And eventually, Billy Johnson built a stone residence at the base of the bluff. And this is one of the few, or the only building today that is still standing from these 1859 lithographs. In 1920, the Billy Johnson farm was purchased by former Governor Emanuel Phillip. Phillip had been born in the area in 1861 and had admired this farm as a boy and was able to purchase it in his retirement years. Phillip added greatly to the estate, making it one of the show places of Sauk County. Governor Phillip added on to the Billy Johnson house, which you can see here on the left, with a very big classically styled addition on the right. And this became a summer retreat for him and his family. The property later became the home of an order of Franciscan nuns that still live there today. And again, this is one of the only buildings that exists from these 1859 lithographs. Moving to the other side of Sauk County, we come to a scene of the railroad bridge at Kilbourne City and the Wisconsin Hydraulic Company Dam. And this is the location of what we now know as Wisconsin Dells. And the story of this image, including the dam and the railroad bridge, is all tied up in the story of the lost settlement of Newport, which was just downstream from Wisconsin Dells. In the 1850s, a village named Newport was started along both sides of the Wisconsin River in hopes that a dam would be built there across the Wisconsin River, as well as a railroad bridge for the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad. And promoters of Newport entered into agreements with Byron Kilbourne, one of the founders of Milwaukee and owner of the La Crosse and Milwaukee Railroad. However, through shrewd business practice or deceit, Kilbourne was able to obtain the dam charter from the promoters of Newport and was secretly planning his own dam further upstream, as well as a railroad crossing not at Newport but in a new city that would be platted by him and called Kilbourne. When all of the news for that broke, Newport eventually died, and a village of over 1,500 people was completely turned into a ghost town. The dam was eventually built in the Wisconsin Dells area beginning in 1855, and Kilbourne City was platted and surveyed in 1856. By 1857, the first railroad bridge was completed across the Wisconsin River at this area. And originally, as shown in the lithograph, it was a covered railroad bridge with sides and a tin roof. That bridge went up in a spectacular blaze in 1866. It was replaced later by two iron bridges, the last of which was built in 1893 and is still in use at Wisconsin Dells. Looking back at the lithograph again, we see in the foreground a lumber raft with a raftsman on it, and the bridge, the dam, of course, was great contention with the lumbermen who were bringing logs down the Wisconsin River, and at various times they took force in trying to remove the dam, twice trying to blow it up or have it removed legally. So on and off during the late 1800s, the dam was either in disrepair, being used, or being fought against. In 1905, the Southern Wisconsin Power Company acquired the land and the dam rights at Kilbourne and started to propose designs for the first hydroelectric dam along the Wisconsin River. However, this new dam would raise the water level in the upper dells 17 feet, and that was in conflict with people like H.H. Bennett, who promoted the natural beauty of the area and didn't want to flood some of the features of the upper dells. Of course, the dam proponents won out, and the new dam was completed in August of 1909. That dam, of course, still exists today along with the powerhouse there at Wisconsin Dells. And in the background you can see the modern car bridge, and just beyond that the railroad bridge going across in the same location as the 1859 lithograph. The last image we want to talk about tonight is that of the Alba House in Reedsburg. This was a pioneer-era hotel, rather large, built in 1856 by Alba Barrett Smith, so named after his first name because Smith was a little too common. Alba Smith was from Ohio, and he built this hotel at the southeast corner of Main and Walnut in downtown Reedsburg. It was one of the largest buildings in town, being 40 by 62 feet with 3 stories and a second-story porch. Later it was called the Exchange House and also the Central House. The Alba House had a large ballroom for dances and dinners, and when a ball was announced at the Alba House, a scramble was usually made by the young men of the area to secure the use of a horse and carriage, as most farmers only had oxen at their farm, which were more dependable, but wouldn't get you to the dance very fast. The Alba House had a rival called the Mansion House, which was nearby, and the owners were partisan rivals. So if you were a Republican, you gathered at the Alba House, and if you were a Democrat, you gathered at the Mansion House. The 1885 Sanborn map of Reedsburg shows what was inside the Alba House, now known as the Central House, and it included a saloon and grocery and dry goods store on the first floor, as well as a barber shop, offices, dining room, and a kitchen in the back. And of course, on the second and third floor were the hotel rooms. Here's a picture of the Alba House, remarkably similar to the lithograph. The Alba House went up in a spectacular blaze on April 12, 1896. This is one of the earliest images in Sauk County of a fire in progress. And you can see, of course, all the people standing by watching this Pioneer-era hotel go up in flames. Fires in downtown Sauk County communities usually resulted in larger and better buildings, and certainly the case here in Reedsburg. The Alba House was replaced by its owner, William Stolte, by the Stolte Hotel immediately in 1896. This was a 90-foot by 95-foot building, 3 stories tall. Eventually it had 39 hotel rooms, and construction included 9 miles of electrical wiring. Indoor plumbing was still relatively new, so while the building had hot and cold running water, there were several shared bathrooms and only 3 bathtubs. The building was highly successful and again had a hotel on upper floors like the Alba House, with commercial establishments including the Mueller Drug Store on the first floor. And the building still exists as a landmark cornerstone building in downtown Reedsburg. If you're interested in looking at William Canfield's map in more detail, or finding the name of perhaps a Sauk County ancestor that might be listed on it, you can find the map on our website. And here's a close-up of the map, one of the areas showing the names of landowners and articles of interest like the Babb's Prairie just to the west of Reedsburg. You can find Canfield's map on our website at saukcountyhistory.org. If you go to the Research tab at the top of the page, you'll find a link to all of our Sauk County maps. And included in the 1859 map are the indexes that I talked about earlier, which list all of the 1,700 landowners listed on the map, as well as points of interest, and you can find those alphabetically or by township. There's also a link on our website to the Library of Congress page where you can download a copy of the map for yourself. The Sauk County Historical Society is supported by our members, who generously provide their membership support and donations to make all of this possible. And we invite you to become a member if you are not already. You can simply scan the QR code on the screen here on the right side for membership. We also invite you to join our YouTube channel that you're watching tonight. If you could subscribe, we would appreciate that. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, so we get some added features available to us from YouTube. The Sauk County Historical Society also has a free app for Android and Apple devices, and you can find those at the Google Play Store or the Apple Store, or by simply scanning the QR codes shown on this screen. So we invite you to become engaged. We're using technology to reach out and to bring Sauk County history to life.